Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And today, once again, we are taking up the next gate of our 108 gates of Dharma illumination. And today we are on gate 62, which is the faculty of wisdom. So our gate statement for today says, the faculty of wisdom is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we really see all Dharmas. So again, we're in the middle of a section of this text on the 108 gates, which is about the 37 constituent factors of Bodhi, or awakening. So we have looked at the 4 foundations of mindfulness, we've looked at the 4 exertions, or the 4 restraints, we've looked at the 4 bases of spiritual power, and now we're working on the 5 faculties that lead to liberation. So we've looked at belief, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, and finally this week it's wisdom, or prajna, which is said to be the highest virtue. So if your Buddhism is linear, something is leading up to wisdom, right? So this is said to be kind of the highest virtue. So we've seen how these 5 faculties are connected and how they all support each other. You know, these 5 don't actually arise individually. We can point to them individually and talk about them individually, but of course we know that actually they're quite deeply interconnected and that they all arise together. So we need belief, effort, mindfulness, concentration in order for wisdom to show itself, right? So the wisdom is already there. It's not that these things will create it, but we need these 5 things working together so that we can actually be in touch with all of these faculties. So one way to understand prajna is that it sees the emptiness of all things, right? So that's what prajna is about. So we have balance, the kind of balance that we talked about last week when we talked about concentration. We have balance because we are not overly excited or overly disappointed by what we see, right? We see all things, the emptiness of all things. So we see each thing as it is. We don't get swept away by craving and aversion, running after things, running away from things. So wisdom supports concentration, concentration supports wisdom. So as an example of how all of these things work together, you know, each one supports the others. So wisdom is a counter to ignorance, of course, but it can't exist on its own as an abstract concept. So, you know, wisdom isn't separate from the other 4 faculties of awakening or for the other paramitas or perfections, right? Wisdom isn't something that's kind of sits out here by itself. You know, we can look at ignorance and we can look at wisdom and say, well, these are individual discrete things. But of course, they're all tied up together. So we need to understand how each of all of these other 4 faculties is connected to wisdom, or how all the other paramitas are connected to wisdom. Otherwise, of course, in the case of these faculties, we can use them for good or not, right? We can use them for something wholesome or something not wholesome. Faith, effort, mindfulness, concentration are no good if they don't also contain some measure of wisdom. So diligence, patience, generosity, all the other paramitas, you know, aren't actually perfections unless they contain some wisdom. We can use these things for things that are not wholesome, or we can get hijacked by them or sort of misunderstand them, right? Too much faith can be sort of a blind, I don't know, a blind trust. You know, we need the wisdom to see what are we actually believing in, right? What are we actually concentrating on? What is going on there? So, you know, ethics or morality don't work either without some wisdom. Hojo-san says, without prajna, the precepts become a lifeless set of rules, right? If it's just, you know, do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it becomes kind of dead, right? If we don't have the wisdom to see how are those precepts arising? How are we using them? We can just apply them rigidly without seeing the actual circumstances of this moment. You know, if we strictly applied do not kill, we couldn't live on this planet. You know, we couldn't eat things. You know, so we have to be a little bit wise about how are we considering precepts? How are we enacting precepts in our lives so they don't just become something which is dead or something which is unskillful. So we can make the same mistake in our zazen, of course. You know, if I think, well, this is my zazen designed to make me better at getting what I want or allowing me to achieve my self-centered goals, then of course that's zazen without prajna. Hojo-san says that if we do that, our practice has nothing to do with Buddhist teachings, right? So wisdom, real wisdom, is essential. According to the Heart Sutra, prajna paramita is the essence of Buddhist teaching. It is necessary to the transformation of our life from samsara to nirvana, right? So we even need some wisdom in our zazen. As we know, wisdom isn't something we acquire. It's not like book learning or life experience or something like that. Those things are not unrelated, right? But wisdom isn't something we're going to go out there and get for ourselves or grasp for ourselves. Those kinds of knowledges are not separate, but we need to kind of see how they all work together. So we may certainly study what our ancestors and teachers have said about the Dharma, about how the universe works, about what Buddha taught, how we can effectively live our lives as bodhisattvas, right? What is our experience of moving through the world? Then we might do some reflecting and some thinking on our own about whether those teachings match our own experience or how they match our own experience of the way things are in our day-to-day lives and in the way we move through the world. At the same time, we establish a sitting practice so we can understand things in a non-intellectual way. We can understand things in the way of dropping off body and mind. So all of these kinds of activities are not unrelated, and they all support each other. So while we're told that wisdom or awakening are already present, there's nothing we need to go out and get, there's nothing we need to acquire. And in fact, letting go of thinking allows our wisdom to arise. But we're also not born knowing how to live as bodhisattvas. If we were, this would be easy. If we were born knowing how to do this, we would not perhaps be so committed to engaging in this practice and allowing our wisdom, our awakening to manifest. If it was a case of returning to some sort of unformed state, like let go, let go, let go, until we return to some, I don't know, undescribable state or something, then children would be less inclined to unskillful behavior than adults. And yet we know, children can be selfish. Children don't always understand consequences, cause and effect, right? So it's not a case of let go, let go, let go of everything we know and know how to do. We still have to be careful. So we have to live in practice in order for our wisdom to manifest. So we have to use all of the faculties that we've talked about here. There is learning to do, but wisdom is not just a case of being clever in a kind of an everyday sense. Wisdom in this context is a spiritual practice. And sometimes it's difficult, right? Sometimes it's not so easy. So somebody asked Dogen once how practitioners in Japan could ever hope to attain wisdom because everyone there was stupid and narrow-minded as opposed to the Chinese. So somebody clearly had some experience of something. We're also stupid and narrow-minded. How do we have any hope of manifesting any kind of wisdom? We all value the wrong things. Well, I shouldn't say, I don't know if this practitioner is Chinese or Japanese, but the idea is these Japanese are valuing the wrong things, looking up to the wrong kinds of people, even if they do zazen, like what hope is there for them? And Dogen says, well, it doesn't really matter whether people are brilliantly intelligent or not. It doesn't matter if they have a lot of education or they don't. If brilliant intelligence was required, he says, then Buddhist teachings wouldn't have survived this long because there aren't that many geniuses in every country. If it really took that, we wouldn't have the teachings. We wouldn't have the practice. It wouldn't have survived. We couldn't have cultivated it and handed it on. What would we have transmitted? There would have been nobody who could have received it and engaged in it and transmitted it to somebody else. If it really took this kind of brilliant genius intelligence, he says that's not it. That's not the point. That's not what wisdom is about. But he says if people have right faith, then they can see through delusion, no matter how smart they are or not, right? It's about having faith in the practice and trust in the practice. She says, without doubt, all people are abundantly endowed with the true seeds of prajna, only they rarely accept it and have not yet received and used it, right? Or as Uchiyama Roshi explains this statement, each and every one of us is living out the reality of life. So each and every one of us is in touch with prajna. Do we know that? Do we live from that place? Do we manifest it? Do we make use of it? Maybe not, as baby bodhisattvas, as Buddhism would say. So a short description of prajna is that it sees everything as it is, right? It sees the emptiness of everything. It sees everything as it is. So it cuts through the delusion that impairs our ability to see real reality, right? To see suchness. So since prajna is all about reality, it is not some abstract thing out here. It's easy to talk about prajna in some pretty lofty terms, But prajna is about reality, and reality is right here. So, wisdom is not something kind of in outer space someplace. It helps us understand what our lives are really about, how to conduct our lives in this concrete world. Prajna puts us right in the middle of this place and time, seeing everything with nothing left out. Right? So it's very real. It's very concrete, right? It's right here. If you read around, you will find a lot of descriptions of prajna, depending on the stream of Buddhism, who's talking about it, what the time frame is, what country the author is from. There are many, many, many kinds of descriptions about prajna. So prajna is understanding the Four Noble Truths. Prajna is understanding the nature of self. Prajna is understanding absolute and relative, or form and emptiness. Prajna is cutting off all delusions and passions, right? You can read all kinds of descriptions or explanations of what prajna is about. And you just start to think, okay, which one is it? What am I really supposed to know here? What am I really supposed to be doing here? Will the real prajna police stand up, right? So, which of these things is prajna about? Of course, the answer is all of the above, right? But it's not like a reading list or a study curriculum. Well, first we understand the Four Noble Truths, and then we understand the nature of self, and then we get Form and Emptiness, right? It's not like you're going down the checklist and saying, I'm going to learn about all this stuff, and then somehow I'm going to have wisdom. What it's really saying is that if we see reality clearly, if we really see, as this gate statement says, all dharmas as they really are, then we can't help but understand the Four Noble Truths. We can't help but understand the nature of self. And we can't help but understand what form and emptiness is about, and all the rest of those things, and the three marks of existence, and the three poisons, and all the other things that our teachers tell us about, right? If we're really seeing reality, we're seeing all of those aspects of reality. So when we're describing prajna, it's like we want to grab a little piece of it and say, well, it's this, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. But if we take the largest possible view, prajna is simply we see all things as they are. And if we see all things as they are, we understand what Buddha saw, and we understand what Buddha was teaching. So all of those things are facets of reality, aspects of reality. So Uchiyama Roshi says, all Buddhist teachings are ultimately the same. They are not difficult to understand. Yet if you don't clarify the fundamental expressions, they are ungraspable. Once you make it clear, you will know that Mahayana, one mind, wondrous Dharma, and all other expressions in Buddhist literature indicate only one reality. Prajna, Mahayana, or Jiju Yudzamai all work on this basis. So he's telling us, if we see one thing, we see all of it. So all of that can sound pretty abstract, right? If we just let go of everything, we allow our natural wisdom to show itself, somehow we can just sort of sit back and everything will be okay. Let go, let go, let go, let go. It can feel, although the letting go is active, it can feel a bit like disengaging, or like, we're headed for something which is not here. That approach ignores the world of form, which is sort of right here in front of us. If we misunderstand that, it's easy for us to ignore what is concretely right in front of us. So wisdom is not separate from compassion. They don't obstruct each other, right? Simply to have wisdom is okay, but we can't ignore the rest of this one unified reality. So wisdom and compassion are both there, and they don't obstruct each other. They don't get in each other's way. So what does all this wisdom mean in this samsaric world of here and now? So Hojo-san kind of had the same question, right? How can we know if all these teachings about prajna are real? Even though prajna is concrete, we'd like to think it's kind of abstract. He's saying, how do we even know that all these teachings about wisdom are real? In the end, as part of his practice, he came to a conclusion. So he says, the Dharma Eye, or Buddha's wisdom, or prajna, is not a certain way of using our brain. It's what's there when I let go of my thought. It sees both sides of reality. This is Zazen in my experience. Zazen itself is Buddha's wisdom. But when I try to explain this, it becomes a concept made by humans, and then it's not reality anymore. To really see it, we have to practice. So Hojo-san had the same questions. He was working on this too, right? We're not the only ones with questions about wisdom. So it's important to remember that wisdom isn't a state. It's not a thing, that we can grab or sometimes even describe. It's an activity. It's a practice, right? It's a spiritual practice. So elsewhere, Hojo-san says, we must be careful to remember that prajnaparamita is something to be practiced. Prajna, or wisdom, is not simply a matter of how our brain works. In Shobogenzo Makahanya Haramitsu, Dogen Zenji refers to the whole body's clear seeing. He's reminding us that this wisdom should be practiced with our whole body and mind. Seeing with the whole body and mind means we become one with the emptiness of the five skandhas. The five skandhas become five skandhas that are completely empty. Zazen is itself prajna. The five skandhas, whole body and mind, clearly see the five skandhas, whole body and mind. There is no separation between subject and object. So it's important that we keep hearing about seeing and practicing wisdom with the whole body and mind. We so often hear that this is a transcendent wisdom, right? It's not just cleverness or book learning or intelligence, it's a transcendent wisdom. So it makes it sound like we're trying to go someplace else. What are we transcending? It feels like we're trying to elevate ourselves out of our day-to-day problems or out of our day-to-day responsibilities or our day-to-day suffering or something like that. Transcending literally means climbing across, right? So it doesn't mean we leave the world of form behind, or that there's sort of no wisdom to be found in our everyday lives, our everyday activities, walking the dog and balancing the checkbook and washing the dishes and sweeping the floor. We don't leave that stuff behind, and wisdom is not separate from that. So as Hojo-san says, there's no separation of subject and object. So here's what Dogen has to say. When the mind is dropped away, the Dharma or reality transcends seeing and hearing. When this wisdom is thoroughly investigated, the way transcends emotional thinking. At this very time, how are the bodies of all you people? From birth, both ears are aligned with the shoulders. The spiritual cloud, Ling Yun, was enlightened at the sight of peach blossoms. So this is a piece from the Eihei Kodoku. This is a little thing that he said to his Sangha. So when the mind is dropped away, the Dharma or reality transcends seeing and hearing. When this wisdom is thoroughly investigated, the way transcends emotional thinking. And the next thing he says is, at this very time, how are the bodies of all you people? So isn't that kind of interesting? He says the Dharma is bigger than seeing and hearing, and the way is bigger than emotional thinking. He doesn't say wisdom is apart from those things, because in this very next sentence, he's talking about the reality of these five skandhas. How are the bodies of all you people, right? This is how we engage wisdom, right? So it transcends seeing and hearing, it transcends emotional thinking, it doesn't leave those things behind. Those are the activities of this body and mind. So wisdom isn't out there someplace. Wisdom is right here. He also makes reference, he says, the spiritual cloud or Ling Yun was enlightened at the sight of peach blossoms. So, using these eyes, these physical eyes, led to his awakening with this particular guy, right? So, he sees the thusness, the suchness, the reality of peach blossoms, and, he has some kind of awakening experience, right? So we're not leaving the body and mind behind when we're dealing with wisdom. We've got no other opportunity to experience emptiness and awakening than with this body and mind and in this world of form. So wisdom is here. It's already right here. There are lots of images and metaphors in this tradition that are associated with wisdom. Anything that looks like light, including the candle on the altar. You will hear descriptions and things like radiant light and illumination and all of those kind of things are images of wisdom. There's a reason there's a candle on the altar, right? That light is often a metaphor for wisdom. We hear things like putting down our own yardsticks, taking a broader perspective. Manjushri Bodhisattva, of course, is an image of wisdom. We'll get back to him in a little bit. Seeing with the eyes of Buddha, or seeing with the Dharma Eye, is an image of wisdom. So when you run across these things in the literature, typically there's some kind of prajna happening there. So seeing is important, right? The faculty of wisdom is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we really see all Dharmas. So the seeing is an important component here. Hojo-san sometimes talks about the five eyes of Buddha. So quick review here. There's the physical eye, right? There's the divine eye, which transcends ordinary time and space, which supposedly human beings can achieve with concentration. So here again, we see how these five faculties are supporting each other. The third one is the prajna eye, which of course sees emptiness, right? But this prajna eye tends to let go of form. It doesn't distinguish anything. So the prajna eye can't save beings. Prajna eye lives up here, right? You can't distinguish between forms. It doesn't pay attention to characteristics. So the prajna eye alone can't save beings. That's why we also need the Dharma Eye. Dharma Eye sees beings. Dharma Eye knows what to do to save them. right? It sees their suffering and it makes a plan. It knows what's the skillful means that we need in order to save beings. This is what happens when we open the hand of thought, right? And the fifth eye is the Buddha eye. Buddha eye sees everything everywhere, including everything that those first four eyes can see. So it's the largest possible eye, right? So those five Buddha eyes. So clearly wisdom is critical to doing our bodhisattva work in the world. It's not enough to just try to get some emptiness for ourselves and then take that and go home, right? We need to turn that around and use it in our bodhisattva work in the world. So even, if we do become able to see all things equally in the midst of prajna, it's not enough, right? We can't cling to that as a goal. I'm going to sit here until I get myself some prajna, and then I'm going to take it and use it for my own purposes, right? We need to turn that back around. So we need to cultivate each of these kinds of seeing if we're going to try to do any kind of good for anybody else or to add some kind of wholesomeness in the world. We need the physical eye, we need the divine eye, we need the prajna eye, but we need to not stop there. We need to go on, cultivate the Dharma eye. So yes, cultivate the wisdom, but then how do we use it? So Hojo-san says, the Heart Sutra points to the essential role of prajna in our efforts to fulfill our vows. To follow the bodhisattva path, we study and practice prajnaparamita, the wisdom that sees impermanence, knows self, emptiness, and interdependent origination. When we clearly see this reality that we and other things exist together without fixed independent entities, our practice is strengthened. We understand that to live by vow is not to accept a particular fixed doctrine, but is a natural expression of our life force, right? So it's not like we're going to memorize a bunch of stuff and then we have wisdom and then, that's our checklist for wisdom forever and ever. Wisdom doesn't work like that. So it's the natural expression of our life force, and we can really see Uchiyama Roshi's influence there, right? That sounds like something he would say. So again, we see that wisdom is not about absorbing and internalizing, a set of dogmas or a list of rules or something like that. It's not about convincing ourselves that various facts about the world are true just because Buddha says or just because teachers say or ancestors say or something, right? It's not about convincing ourselves that what they saw is true and therefore we should sort of believe the same thing. Something that's true in this moment, of course, might not be true in the next moment because of impermanence, so we can't get stuck there. If we make decisions based on old facts, that's no good, right? We need to be able to move with reality. So we can't just sort of memorize the book and then spout out the answers, right? Or, if we do that, it just becomes dead words. So like those precepts become, kind of a lifeless list. If we sort of memorize the book and say, that's it, those words are dead words, even though they were skillfully given perhaps at some point, right? What is the relation to this moment here and now? So we need to make sure it's still a natural expression of our life force. Dead words are not a natural expression of our life force, right? So it's not, the reading and memorizing isn't quite enough. So Uchiyama Roshi says, in Buddhism, wisdom or prajna is neither intelligence in worldly matters, nor is it scientific knowledge. By prajna, the reality of life itself starts to work. It's the foundation from which we make choices. In other words, each time we make a choice, we are to make it from the perspective of universal life, all things being equal and interconnected. So the wise choice is the one that's in the best interest of the well-being for everyone, including ourselves, right? We don't leave ourselves out of that. If we're leaving ourselves out, then we're not seeing the complete picture because we are not disconnected from what's going on. So, the best choice is the one that is, leads to the greatest well-being for ourselves and for others. Seeing what that is not so easy, right? It is not always easy to tell what's in the best interest of ourselves and everybody else. So we need a little wisdom there. In the Mahayana, the most important thing about prajna is seeing both form and emptiness. So we've talked about that as an aspect, and in the Mahayana, that gets a lot of play. We hear a lot about really deeply understanding form and emptiness. Seeing one reality from two sides and expressing two sides in one action is the way that Hojo-san puts that, right? I use that one a lot. I think it's a handy way to summarize, right? So seeing one reality from two sides, expressing two sides in one action. And again, so we have the wisdom to see one reality from two sides, but then we need to go out and express that in some kind of activity for the good of all beings. So that's what Shuto writes about in the Sandokai, right? In the harmony of difference and sameness, being in the intersection of ultimate truth and conventional truth. How do we stand in the middle of that intersection and clearly see what's going on? So Dogen described it this way. He says, in the realm of Dharma, there is no center or edge. For the body of wisdom, there is no front or back. I think it's a great image, right? There's no center, no edge, no front, no back. So when we get to Manjushri, we'll talk about that again. So he also says the form and emptiness are so completely interpenetrated that even talking about form and emptiness is a problem. As soon as we say form is form, or emptiness is emptiness, or form is emptiness, or emptiness is form, we're drawing distinctions. We're carving up this one unified reality. So even to think about and try to compare these two things and describe what they are in relation to something else is already a problem. As soon as we label form and emptiness, we forget that they're not actually not separate, right? We've created some separation. So he says the best way to express prajna is to sit zazen and let go of thought. And, he says zazen itself is prajna. So simply taking this posture, keeping the eyes open, breathing deeply, opening the hand of thought is itself prajna. It is a complete expression of wisdom. So you may know that typically it's Manjushri Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva of wisdom on the altar in a soto or a place where people sit zazen. It's not Shakyamuni sitting here. It's Manjushri. So, when you come into our zendo here, usually when the side altar is open, Manjushri is Shakyamuni is over there. That's where we do ceremonies. That's where we do liturgy. That's where we do ritual. Where we sit zazen, it's typically Manjushri. So, our sort of tiny hatto, our tiny Dharma hall has Shakyamuni. Soto has Manjushri. He sits on a lion. Often you'll see the picture as he is here. He's sitting on a lion. Sometimes he has a two-edged sword to cut through delusion. So I'm guessing one of the reasons he has this two-edged sword, the sword has two sides of one reality, right? So Manjushri is said to be the oldest bodhisattva we have in the tradition. We can't do much without wisdom, so it makes sense to me that he was the first being that got formed or got formulated or something. It makes sense he's been there from the beginning. We call Prajnaparamita the mother of all Buddhas. We can't manifest awakening without Prajna. So it makes sense that he's one of the oldest foundational kind of bodhisattvas that we have. We said earlier that wisdom isn't a thing or a state, but an activity or a practice. So there's a bit of danger, I think, in anthropomorphizing wisdom into a being over there. It kind of makes wisdom into a thing, into an entity or something which is separate. So we can take inspiration from Manjushri and from his sword, but we've got to actually take up that sword ourselves and do our own wisdom practice and then take that practice into the world. Which is what we do, actually, of course, every time we're sitting and we find our minds kind of wandering around and we come back to here and now. That is Manjushri's practice of wisdom, right? Every time we're about to say something unskillful and then we go, oh, wait a minute, do I really want to say that? That's Manjushri. That's the practice of wisdom. Every time we're taken aback by something happening that we don't expect and we, go, oh, wait a minute, why was I expecting this to be some other way? Why am I setting myself up for suffering by wanting things to be other than they are? We have that little bit of insight. There's Manjushri. He just showed up with his sword, right? So it's a practice. What Manjushri is doing is a practice. So we can see why Dogen and everyone else says zazen is prajna, right? Letting go of the stuff we're clinging to and running away from is an act of wisdom. It's a manifestation of our wisdom, and it also encourages our deepening practice, encourages us to even see more deeply, even see more clearly. So again, these things are supporting each other. We've got the sense to see that whatever it is that we're clinging to isn't helping. It's based on our story. It's based on something we've created. We've got the sense to open our hand and say, oh, I can let go of that. I can see clearly what's happening. I can see clearly my delusion. I can let go of it or choose to do something skillful instead, right? That is Manjushri's practice. So that's not always fun. That's not always easy. Somehow, poor old Manjushri isn't nearly as popular as Avalokiteshvara. Everybody wants a little compassion and sympathy and help. in their lives, that seems like something which is comforting. Mostly we don't want to be confronted with an angry guy with a two-edged sword. We don't want the razor sharp sword in our lives. We want the comfort and the sympathy, right? And the compassion. So, of course, even to say that that sword has two edges is a problem. It has an infinite number of edges. It's not actually as simple, right, as one and two. That sword doesn't actually sever one thing from another. So we can say, here's this razor sharp two-edged sword that's cutting off delusion, but again, we have to be careful with words because we're not actually severing delusion from awakening. There was already no separation. So he's pointing something out to us, but he's not cutting off delusion. Sometimes we say it cuts off delusion. Wisdom and ignorance aren't actually separate. Wisdom and delusion are not actually separate. So seeing through our delusion doesn't get rid of our delusion. It means we see it for what it is. We see all, as this gate statement says, we see all dharmas, clearly see all dharmas for what they are. So we see the delusion. Doesn't mean the delusion goes away. Doesn't mean that this world of relative truth goes away in favor of something else, some kind of absolute truth, which is better, right? Or is some kind of goal. So we can watch the movie, we can enjoy the movie, and still know that it's not real. Right? We can see our delusion. We can kind of laugh at ourselves for our delusion. Sometimes we need to talk in terms of relative truth. That's fine. We can watch the movie, enjoy the movie, and know that it's not real. I read once a long time ago that soap opera stars get a lot of letters from viewers with a lot of advice about how they are supposed to solve their characters' problems. But they're writing to the characters, right? They're not actually writing to the actors and actresses. They're writing to the characters and telling them how they should solve their lives in Pine Valley or Bay City or wherever they happen to be, right? They comment on the story because they think what they're seeing is reality somehow. So, of course, this was in the days before reality TV. I think it's even a little more confusing now. We're not really sure what on TV is reality and, what is not. And even reality TV is staged, to a certain extent. So, here's folks who are so completely caught up in the movie, if you will, they can't see through the movie. They can't just watch it and enjoy it. They actually think what they're seeing is real. So that's kind of what we do with our delusion, with our stories, right? We make the story and we project it out there and we get so attached to it, we think it's real. If we have wisdom, if we have prajna, we can see and enjoy all of that stuff that's happening, but we also can hold it lightly. We also know this is my perception. This is something I created. It's possible there's another way to look at this, or there's another way to look at this reality. So anyway, if we can see the form in the emptiness and the emptiness in the form, then we are practicing the way Manjushri practices. So there's a story in the Prajnaparamita literature in which Manjushri describes contemplating the Buddha. So he says he's not contemplating only the physical characteristics of the Buddha. He's not contemplating only the Buddha's body or what actions he's taking or something like that. He's seeing the suchness of the Buddha, which he really is as a manifestation of the Dharma, right? So he's actually doing this along with a lot of other practitioners, and Buddha's going, what are you doing? And Manjushri says, well, I'm contemplating the Buddha, but here's how I'm doing it. I'm not actually seeing only the physical form, the characteristics, the activities, the world of form. I'm also seeing the suchness of Buddha, Buddha as a manifestation of emptiness. So you may have heard the teaching that if you see the Dharma, then you see the Buddha. And if you see the Buddha, then you see the Dharma. That's kind of what this story illustrates, right? Practicing the wisdom that attends to both form and emptiness. So Manjushri saw the Buddha, and because he really saw the Buddha, he also saw the Dharma. He also saw the reality of this sort of the functioning of this one unified reality. So there's another story about Manjushri in Buddhist mythology. He's standing outside the temple gate, and Buddha calls to him, Manjushri, Manjushri, why don't you enter? And Manjushri answers, I don't see a thing outside the gate, why should I enter? So he's making the point, of course, that there is no inside or outside, or as we heard a minute ago, there's no center and edge, there's no front and back. So he says there's no inside, no outside, no Buddha field, no not Buddha field, nothing which is not this temple. So there's nowhere to go, because here and now have no boundaries. So, there's no place else to be. There's no other time to be. There's no other place to be. So he sees no inside and outside. That's a smart answer. We get what he's saying, right? He's making his point to the Buddha. We understand what he's doing. But that's a kind of answer, I think, that can also lead to paralysis. I'm so wise that I don't make any distinctions between things, so there's no action I need to take because everything is already equal. It can kind of make us think, again, if I just let go, see broadly, I can sit back, everything's fine, I have no responsibilities as a bodhisattva, there's nothing I need to do. Well, that's why wisdom and compassion are also not separate. It's why they arise together. If we're in this for our own wisdom so we can fix our own problems or look more knowledgeable about Zen than the next guy, then we're not complete bodhisattvas. Our wisdom is not complete either. So maybe you've been in the situation where you've been listening to a Dharma talk. It comes up question time. Somebody's got a question for the teacher. Questioner goes on and on and on and on and on to the break of dawn, quoting a lot of texts, spouting out a lot of teachings, goes on forever before actually getting to the question. Everyone pretty quickly sees that the whole point of the question was for the questioner to demonstrate how much she already knew. Right? It's a real opportunity to have a platform and say, look at all the wisdom I have. I'm asking the question, but I'm humble bragging, right? I'm really here to show off how much I already know. So is that wisdom? It's not coupled with much compassion for the teacher or for the people in the room, right? It's a pretty self-centered kind of wisdom. So we need wisdom and compassion together. So wisdom is the counter to ignorance, just like concentration is the counter to distraction, or effort is the counter to laziness, or faith is the counter to doubt. Everything's the kind of a spectrum. These things are all interconnected. So it's not enough just to stand outside the gate, kind of do our spiritual bypassing. There's no inside, no outside. I don't need to come in. I like to think, when I read that story, I like to think that after Manjushri kind of answered the Buddha and demonstrated that he knew about, no inside, no outside, that he goes inside the temple gate. Maybe he cooks dinner for everybody, or he patches the ceiling, or he takes out the trash, or does something, right, to use his wisdom for beings. So, he gives the smart answer, but I like to think he's smart enough to know that's not where you stop. At some point, you go into the temple gate, right? You go into your life. We can't just take our wisdom and awakening and go off home. For our own purposes, we have to go out the door and join the world. I frequently say to practitioners, don't check your zazen at the door. Don't leave your zazen in the zendo. Don't leave your prajna here. It has to go out the door with you. So sometimes in this tradition, it's called returning to the marketplace with bliss-bestowing hands. If you are familiar with the 10 ox herding pictures, after the awakening experience comes, we return to the marketplace. We return to the world with bliss-bestowing hands. So we take our wisdom back into the marketplace, into the workplace, into the family, into the sangha, wherever we are, and we bestow bliss, right? We liberate beings from suffering. We try to ameliorate some suffering in the world. So let's make sure we take the wisdom of these 5 faculties into our lives, as Uchiyama Roshi would say, living out the reality of life. See all dharmas as they are. What would you like to say about wisdom, prajna, taking our wisdom into the world, whatever is bubbling for you? And again, don't forget to unmute yourself so that we can hear your words of wisdom for today. Who's got something to say? Nobody's feeling wise this morning?
I guess I could share a few philological tidbits for the day.
Please do.
um, so I guess just first to share the Tibetan translation, the translation from the Tibetan for this gate statement. It's very similar, but in this case it says, the faculty of knowledge is a gateway to the light of the Dharma, for it leads to wisdom of direct perception, is the phrase that it uses. And what it's translating as direct perception in the Chinese, the version that Dogen had, it's gen and the gen is the same as genjo in Genjo Koan. And in the translation that Nishijima did, the one that you shared, it's really seeing, and I think that that's pretty good. So like Gen is usually like actual, like actually seeing. So at any rate, I just thought that the connection between that and Dogen's like favorite phrase Genjo, which he uses all the time, which means like manifesting or actualizing, that was in there. I thought was cool. And then the other little thing that I looked up, so I looked up the word for faculty here, the Sanskrit word, and it's Indriya, which is apparently related to Indra, like the god Indra. And so these are sort of like almost supposed to be like godlike powers, that Indra would wield. So I guess that just sort of shows the importance that they hold in the tradition for things that you really need to kind of try to master as a Buddhist practitioner. So I liked that connection.
Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't talk about that, but yes, it's absolutely true. These things are supposed to be related to Indra. So I like that we can consider them sort of godlike faculties, right? Yeah, so this whole direct perception thing, that's really interesting, isn't it? So this kind of seeing things as they really are, seeing the emptiness of things, seeing what's actually, seeing that in a direct way without the coverings of, thoughts and illusion and delusion and all that stuff. That's a really helpful um, color, right? That's a really helpful, I don't know what the word about connotation. That's not the word I want either, but I'm glad you added it in is where I'm going with that. So thank you for that. That's very good. Other things people would like to say, questions, reflections, comments, experiences. Sawyer, I think I see your hand up.
You do. Yeah, I sort of just thinking about this interplay between wisdom and compassion and seeing and acting, maybe. I'm thinking about this. I sat for a while, practiced for a while with a order of interbeing sangha or Thich Nhat Hanh in Montana like a year or two ago, and the emphasis, and it started to dawn on me that maybe an emphasis in that tradition sort of begins with compassion as sort of the gate into practice, and then sort of out of that maybe wisdom will flower. And in this tradition, or in maybe Soto traditions in general, I started to feel like sort of with its emphasis on Zazen, it's like wisdom is kind of a ground out of which compassion may flower. And to see those two sort of gates in different traditions helped me see that they're always kind of interacting, wisdom and compassion. There's whichever way you sort of, and like you said, maybe compassion is easy, Avalokiteshvara is easier, gets more love than old Manjushri. But yeah, so I guess I'm just riffing around that interplay, and if one should be the entranceway to the other, or should they just both be simultaneous?
That is so interesting, and that's really perceptive. Yeah, oh boy, there's lots to say there. So, on the one hand, wisdom and compassion are said to arise together. On the other hand, we are human beings moving through the world. We are likely to not see all 10,000 Dharma gates at the same time. right? So whatever gate it is that we encounter that moves us into practice, cool. If it's compassion first and then wisdom, we sort of get a handle on wisdom, okay. If it's the other way around, okay. What's really interesting is, of course, Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition is a Zen tradition. It's not Soto Zen, but it is a Zen tradition. What's really interesting is that when we look at how Zen practice evolved, if you will, in this country, Zazen has been really centralized. And of course, it didn't just arrive here and that happened. The roots of that, go back before it arrived in this country. So Zazen is quite central. It is sort of the practice. And because of that, and because we focus there, then there is this real feeling that, oh my gosh, the wisdom is everything. Compassion will somehow happen, but wisdom is the main gate because Zazen is the main gate and Zazen is prajna. I think it's really important that we have balance. There are people that have a harder time participating in our practice, I would guess, because of the intensive focus on wisdom, and we kind of look around and go, where is Avalokiteshvara? At Sangshin, she's in the garden, she's here, but I think we have to actually be quite conscious and intentional about having the balance that says, yeah, wisdom is important, prajna is important, yes, Zazen is intimately tied up with that, but we need to not leave out kind of all these other things. We can't just, only focus on that. So it may well be that here we first enter into the gate of wisdom and then we see compassion and the relationship there and how that arises and how that's necessary and how they're actually not separate. But I think what you're bringing up is really interesting about, what is the central gate? What is the main gate? What seems to be the most important thing, and then what comes after that, right? I don't think there's a right answer to that. I think it manifests differently in different traditions, in different sanghas, even different sanghas in the West. One of the things I'm really coming to understand is there is no one thing called Western Buddhism. Goodness. There's not even one thing called, I don't think Western Soto Zen. I think there are plenty of Dharma centers that would say that a gate of compassion is equally important to a gate of prajna, right? So I think we need to learn how to balance, and I'm glad that you raised that. I think what you're seeing is really interesting, kind of in this American Dharma conversation. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that too, in addition to whatever else is on your mind today. So do you have a follow up for that, or is that okay for you?
Go ahead.
All right. What would other people like to say about that or anything else? Justin's got his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, not so directly on the last question and comments, but what came up for me during the talk regarding wisdom and compassion is how well I work in the psychotherapy world, and there's sort of this weaponization of compassion. I think it's like the whole mindfulness movement, sort of now, sort of moving into realizing there are other facets, which would comprise, like a full practice, and that's been, compassion over the last few years. But what came up for me during the talk is how, there's seems to be a difference between sort of finding an object. A lot of times, I think, sort of in the, therapeutic world, or the sort of self-development world, there's this focus on, okay, like how do we deal with this specific object? I think maybe you could say in a way sort of forms. But the sense that I get during the talk is that, it's more of, embracing like a field of compassion, it's a field of wisdom where it's, finding that, internally, so it's not sort of like a step-by-step process of, okay, here I do this, and focus, focus compassion. Yeah, I find it very, broadening in a way that is very different from, a very, call it Western or call it, I don't know what, everyday social sort of, embrace of those concepts, versus what we do here.
Well, I think we need both, right? So the broader perspective is helpful so that we don't miss something. But we can't ignore the forms either, right? I mean, so if you're identifying a specific circumstance or a specific issue or problem or something that needs some care, needs some attention, we need to not ignore that that's there and it's on fire, right? If we're going to ignore that and say, well, I'm going to take the broadest possible view and say this thing will take care of itself, well, maybe it will, but maybe it won't. If there's an issue we need to address, something's burning, we need to do that. Can we bring to that the wisdom and the compassion of a broader perspective so that we can see clearly cause and effect, in time and space? We can't see it all, but we make some attempt. This thing does not arise without some cause and condition. So what's the cause and condition? If we change the cause and condition, what arises then changes. So, we need the broader thing, but we also need to not ignore the forms. We need to not get stuck on the forms, but we need to not ignore them either. And sometimes it can feel more satisfying or more comfortable or more safe to go up here and say, I'm going to, live in the world of the absolute, or at least in the broadest perspective. And I'm going to just assume, if I take care of the pounds, the pennies will take care of themselves. That was a mixed metaphor. if I take care of the dollars, the pennies will take care of themselves, let's just say. Maybe. So our challenge is, again, see one reality from two sides, express two sides in one action. So how do we see both the form and the emptiness? How do we see both the issue and the larger context, and then take a skillful, wise, compassionate action for the benefit of as many people as possible, or as many beings as possible? That is so not easy, right? Which is why this practice goes on, and why our vows are never complete, because we're constantly doing that. We're constantly holding both views, and using both of those perspectives in the most skillful possible way, right? Not a simple thing to do. Do you have a follow-up or anything else you'd like to say about that?
I don't. That's very clear, and it just sort of reinforces exactly what was being taught today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, of course, I'm just throwing these things out there so that you can let them percolate about your own experience, right? So just like everything else, what I'm telling you is my perception. You need to work with your own understanding and your own experience. What would others like to say? Oh, Hennis has his hand up. Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm this topic is actually related to an essay that I'm working on for my ethics class, so I figured this might be worth asking. But I'm working on a paper on analyzing similarities and differences between Zen ethics and Aristotelian ethics, and something that came up is that Aristotle believes that that all compassion comes from wisdom, and that wisdom inherently leads to compassion. And something else that I noticed is that in the Prajnaparamita, like sutra, or the Heart Sutra, etc. What's interesting to me is that this whole thing about wisdom and stuff is coming from the mouth of Avalokiteshvara, the Mahasattva Bodhisattva of compassion. And I'm sort of wondering, about sort of this idea, could pure wisdom lead to compassion? What would be critiques of that? And what is this view of that? Because that's kind of interesting to me and seems related.
Well, I'm hoping others will help me out on this one. You're writing quite a complicated paper. I also think it's very interesting that it's Avalokiteshvara in the sutra, and it says that Avalokiteshvara, in the course of wisdom, is giving these teachings. So we have the bodhisattva of compassion, and from compassion is coming this wisdom. So I think it's a prime example of how these things are not separate, right? I don't know that. I guess it depends on. There are multiple points of view about which one comes first. It's a chicken or an egg, right? Which is why we say they arise together. Why? Because they're already here. They're both already here. So it's not like we're going to gain something that isn't already here. Wisdom and compassion are already here by virtue of, interdependence and all the marks of existence and Four Noble Truths and all that stuff. So these things are already here. I think it might be easier some days to be in touch with one over the other, or it's easier to see one over the other, or, we're given a Dharma gate that kind of throws us into the middle of, one or the other. But I think they arise together. So my guess is that there is more than one tradition which would say these things are interconnected. One can, seeing one can lead to seeing the other. Acting on the basis of one can lead to acting on the basis of the other, but they are completely interpenetrated. So even to separate them, to talk about them, is kind of a problem. And yet we do that because we have to talk about Dharma, right? That's how we study and how we practice. So I'll be interested. I hope you'll come back at some point, having written your paper with some conclusions for us, so that we can learn with you. I'm going to tap you the way I tap on Doju and say, you're out there getting academic credentials. Please bring back, what you discovered, so that we can all learn from that. It sounds like a really interesting paper. Of course, Mark Ahlstrom probably has something to say about that, because he was a philosophy major too. So you might you might shoot him an email and see what he has to say about that as well. Please, anything else from you, Hennesis, before we go on?
No, just wanted to see what Dojo has to say.
Yeah, good. Please, Doju.
Yeah, so there's sort of an interesting kind of follow-up to that, I guess. So the Heart Sutra is sort of not really representative of Prajnaparamita texts at all, and it's thought probably to have been created in China in like 600 AD, so many hundreds of years after most of the kind of core Prajnaparamita literature was made. And Jan Nattier, who used to be a professor at IU, was sort of the originator of this idea, and it's a really strong argument, I think. But the whole like middle of the text, the part that's negating, everything, it's no eyes, no ears, all that part, is actually extracted word for word from an older Chinese translation of a Prajnaparamita text. And then the part at the beginning about Avalokiteshvara, and then the part at the end with the mantra, are kind of tacked on. So originally it hadn't, the body of the text had nothing to do with Avalokiteshvara. And in fact, Avalokiteshvara, never really shows up in the Prajnaparamita literature. It's not to say, you can't sort of draw a meaningful story, I think, about the connection between wisdom and compassion, but it seems that historically speaking, they might not have actually had anything to do with each other. So,
which is so interesting, right? And it's another, for practitioners, it's another opportunity to say, okay, there is the historical text, and then there's the way we practice with the text. In no way am I negating what Doju just said. I think it's important that we know that. And also, isn't it interesting how, even given that history for this text, somehow practitioners have picked it up and said, oh, there's some meaning here. There's something about this combination, this intersection of Avalokiteshvara and all these things about wisdom that, there's something arising in that intersection which is helpful for practice. I think it's really interesting how in the human sort of spiritual practice, religious impulse, whatever that is, that there's the historical construction of something, and then there's how do we practice with that, right? It's like, I think it's in some ways kind of the way, the same role that myth plays in a society. It's like we can say myths aren't literally true, but that doesn't make them not true, because there's some interesting kind of teaching there, or as Doju says, I called you Dogen, I'm really elevating you today. As Doju says, there's a story there which is meaningful for us, right? It supports our practice. So it's really interesting to know, maybe those two things were kind of kludged together. I would be interested to know why. I mean, like, why those two things? That's interesting. That's really interesting. It's great to have scholars here, who can like shed some light on some of this stuff.
yeah, I think Jan Nattier's like sort of idea was, Avalokiteshvara was really popular at the time that the text would have been made, and was also associated with like mantra and Dharani sort of literature. And so, the end of the text, of course, has the mantra.
Oh, interesting. So because Avalokiteshvara shows up in the beginning, we need to have a mantra on the end because those two things are related. That's
right. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the basic idea of what she
yeah
speculated, but who knows?
And isn't it interesting here? I just said a minute ago, poor old Manjushri, gets short shrift because everybody wants Avalokiteshvara. So here we go. Let's put Avalokiteshvara in this sutra so that it's popular with people. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And yet somehow it's meaningful for us. So we have to be careful what we read into it, I guess. We have to know where it comes from because we have to be careful what we're adding. What story are we adding in there? But again, that doesn't mean that adding that story isn't meaningful in some way. As long as we see carefully what we're doing, the way we read the text is our own kind of thing. If we see carefully what we're doing, that can make for, some interesting discussion and some development of practice. And yet, it's good to know how that thing actually got built. Really interesting. Other things people would like to say today? Sawyer?
Yeah, this might be a good moment to bring forward a question I've been sort of wondering about, which is how do we practice meaningfully, sort of in our here and now emphasis with history? How do we practice wisely with history, whether it's the history of our tradition, whether it's the political and social histories of our society, things like colonization as the foundation of how we live. How do we practice with wisdom amidst things that stretch back and forth in time and influence us deeply, maybe in ways we're not even aware of?
Well, absolutely. So job one is we don't look away, right? So on the one hand, we can't ignore that causes and conditions led up to something. We're here because causes and conditions, were such that it led up to us being here, doing what we're doing. So we can't ignore that. Cause and effect is huge in this tradition. There's koans about how we cannot ignore cause and effect and get away with it, right? So it's important to recognize history. It's important to not look away. For me personally, it's really useful for me to know how things got to be the way they are. So Doju knows I have a long-term interest in what I call Soto Zen modernism, Buddhist modernism. Why do we practice the way we practice in the 21st century West or in 21st century America? For a long time, it was helpful. So when I started kind of looking into that, my thought was, I want to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm not alone in that. Practitioners throughout history have wanted to know, what's the real teaching, and then what kind of got stuck on for all kind of nefarious reasons, to make things popular or to raise money, or I mean, that goes, all the way back. So for some, I wanted to sort of get to the real story. What was the real thing? Well, of course, not possible. Because when you start looking into that, you realize there is no element of that history which didn't add something to the practice. Right? There is no part of that you can kind of lock it off and say, well, that part doesn't count. So I went into that with an agenda, and I pretty quickly realized my agenda was my own perception. I had to really let go of that and hold it loosely. And my thinking around that whole thing has actually changed quite a bit over time. So we can't look away. On the other hand, impermanence, right? The things that happened in the past, causes and conditions, but we can't project that onto today and say, well, because I know what happened in the past, the same thing is going to keep happening, right? So we need that information. We need to use it wisely and skillfully, but we also need to say, this is a fresh moment that's arising. So what's going on right now in front of me? What's going on in this space and time, like right now, because this is the only place I can act. This is the only time in which I can respond. So I need to be aware of what's here, and I might be, aware of maybe what's going to happen as a result of what I'm doing now, but this is the only time and place I have to act. So, I mean, it's not possible as limited human beings to understand all of the causes and conditions that led to this moment. And it's not possible for us as limited human beings to understand all the things that are going to unfold from this moment, and yet we make our best effort, right? It's why vows are never complete. So I think it's useful to dive into how things got the way they are. I think those causes and conditions are useful and interesting. For me, it makes me a better decision maker, because if I understand why things are the way they are, I can understand that, nothing was kind of random, and there might be good reasons for things that I need to take into account, maybe in order to be compassionate. Maybe somebody did something in the past for a reason that I need to understand so that I can have some compassion. So I think all of that is important. Understanding how this tradition is the way it is, oh my goodness, really helpful. This tradition was shaped very intentionally in very particular ways. Pretty much throughout its history, because of course, temples wanted to be credible. Why? Because they wanted to have enough support to do what they were there to do. So did they build up the founders of their temples to be magical, enlightened human beings? Absolutely. Were stories written and circulated that made temples look and seem very powerful? Absolutely. So yeah, that shaping is not new. PR was didn't start happening 20 years ago. PR was happening a long time ago. So this has been very intentionally shaped and massaged all the way up to, as I'm sure Doju can tell us, World War II. Practice, Japan wants to look a certain way. It wants to export a certain kind of practice that Western people can feel okay about adopting. And so certain things get centralized and certain things get marginalized. And, we create a particular kind of practice. We Westerners come to the practice, or we Americans come to the practice and think this is what practice is. I can't tell you how many times I've taken first-time Westerners to Japan, taken them into a temple, had them, they watch something or participate in something, and they go, it's like the scales fall from their eye. Oh, that's why we do what we do. Suddenly there's a huge context. We've got maybe 10% on this side of the pond. There's a huge context for this practice. It's kind of helpful to know what that is. At the same time, here's your cushion, sit down. Right? We don't need to be scholars of Buddhist history to sit down. So I think there's an intersection there. And I think it's why when we talk about wisdom, yes, we need a certain amount of Dharma study. Yes, we need a certain amount of personal reflection, life experience, all of that. And at the same time, we sit down and drop things. I think in order to be well-rounded and to really exercise wisdom and compassion, you kind of need all that stuff. So I think there's a reason it's Zazen, work, and study, right? I think there's a reason it's not just Zazen. I think, those three pieces, we need the balance. So I don't know, would other people like to say things about history? We kind of have the perception, for instance, that Soto Zen has no history of discrimination against certain social groups. Absolutely not true. When I was training in Japan, we were required to go to what we might call in this country diversity training, around a particular group of people, which has been the subject of discriminative activity for many, many years. So if we think we're immune from this, folks, not true. And it goes back before this practice came to the West. So let me not go on about that. What would other people like to say, if anything, so that I don't hog the floor? Comments, questions, things about wisdom today? Anything else this morning? Ado's got her hand up. Let's hear from you.
Well, this is just a response in general kind of to this discussion that it occurred to me, if we're not separate, if we think of this little group today as one being, we're not all going to know all the same things. We're not all going to, but by being a Sangha and we have the opportunity to gain from each other insight that only that person has from their particular training or study or whatever, and it's and each person has something to offer that no one else can, and that's anyway, I'm just appreciating that now.
Absolutely. Well, these Sundays are a good example, right? Look at all the people I'm calling out. It's like, tell us what you know about this. One person can't know it all. So yes, I think that's one of the reasons Sangha's one of the three treasures, right? We get to train and help and support each other, and we sort of can't do that otherwise. It's an important point. Any last things this morning? Questions? Observations? Are we wise enough for today?
I might add.
Oh, Hoshin, please.
Just kind of going off of what Sawyer has been bringing up. We of course deal with karma on a daily basis all the time. Part of why, and this I think kind of gets down to the core of what Zazen is about, at least for me. I can speak for myself only. That when we sit, we attempt to allow the world to become empty, because within our Zazen, it's just us and the wall. And the habits of mind, habits as in karma being that historical process in our, we embody within, when we're on the cushion, the habits of mind become something else and they drop away, hopefully. So just a comment on that, the idea that the history of karma, all of that disintegrates at times. It becomes something else, or you're able to see how much of a phenomenon it all is.
Well, and that's important, isn't it? Because we don't always even see how heavily influenced we are by things. So yes, if we can come to the cushion and drop off body and mind, and I think it's interesting the way you've characterized that, it becomes something else. So it doesn't go away, because we've just said cutting through delusion doesn't separate delusion from wisdom, right? It doesn't mean we're lopping that part off. We can't, because we're karmic beings, right? So of course we carry all of our karmic stuff onto the cushion because we can't not do that. So I think it's really interesting you're using a word that transforms that, even for a little while, into something else. Yep. Zazen is prajna. That's right.
Yeah, and just really quickly, that reminded me of, something that Hojo-san often says, when he's talking about, he says, I'm a Japanese man and I think in Japanese, and, it's different from the way that you approach the world. And, in that sense, he's historically conditioned to be that way. And, Zazen practice is often kind of talked about in terms of deconditioning or being unconditioned. And, again, it's this relative absolute interplay. So going back to Sawyer's question, you have to have both, of course. So both are important.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, he often talks, doesn't he, about how, everything we have is in some ways a gift from our culture, our society, because we've inherited language and certain ways of thinking and social structures and whatnot. So, we are truly not separate from. Mother's dog is barking. That must mean it's time for us to wrap up. Buffy is starting our chant this morning. Any last words today? All right. Thanks so much for a very interesting conversation. Let's wrap up for today, and we'll pitch over to Hoshin for our closing chant.